Hi everyone, I hope you're having a good week. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the first part of Cracking India. We're starting this book this week. It also goes under the name Ice Candyman. That's how it was originally published, but in the US it was published under Cracking India, so that's most likely the version that you have. A couple of things before I get started. This is a hard book. It's hard both in terms of sort of understanding what's going on, given our sort of lack of cultural context in many cases. It's hard because of the subject matter as well. So, I just want to acknowledge that, there's a lot going on with this book that might be hard to understand, but that's why we're reading it, to help us understand, right? And to give us a perspective on an historical event that we might not think about too often, but that really sort of has repercussions today. So, just to warn you, it does have some sort of intense graphic scenes, so just take care while you're reading it. All right, so I'm going to talk you through some things. This might be a little bit of a long video just because I'm giving you a lot of context here that will hopefully help you understand what's going on in the book. So, our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the author, Bapsi Sidhwa. I'm going to talk you through briefly the history of British colonialism in India. Colonialism is going to be a huge theme in the text that we read this semester. And then some of the sort of major themes in Cracking India. I've changed the wording on these slightly. And some of the scenes that reflect those. And then finally, the discussion post that I'm asking you to do for this week. So, about the author, Bapsi Sidhwa was born in Karachi, Pakistan, before it was Pakistan, in 1938, and then later moved with her family to Lahore, which is where the novel is set. Like Lenny, she was born into a Parsi family, so Zoroastrian, and contracted polio when she was 2. And she was 9 at the time of the partition of India. So I'm going to talk about that more as we go through. We're going to sort of get into more of that next week, but she sort of says that Lenny is kind of like her alter ego. It's not really a biography of any kind, but the character Lenny does take on a lot of the author's sort of personal attributes. So, just to give us a little bit of background about the political context that's going on in the novel, India was basically under British control in some form or another for something like 200 years. So the East India Company controlled India through what they called company control from around 1747 through 1858. So a long time. Most of it was controlling commerce and trade. But then the Indian Sepoy Rebellion in 1857 led to direct rule by the British Empire, and then that sort of time was called the British Raj. So, as I mentioned, the British had major control on India's trade and commerce for 200 years prior to the partition, when the British pulled out of India right after World War II. So this is a long and fraught history of sort of British involvement in India. So this is a type of colonialism / imperialism, the definitions of which are really kind of slippery. And the reason that, again, I'm talking to you about this now is because a lot of the works that we're dealing with are post-colonial works. So things that happen, either sort of during or after colonialism, and thinking about the after effects of such. But generally, colonialism constitutes an extraction of resources in favor of the colonizing or imperial country. So from the Encyclopedia of Science, Technology, and Ethics, and I had you read this section for this week, it says, given these difficulties in establishing a clearly bounded definition of colonialism and related terms, These must be seen as constituting a semantic field in which conceptual boundaries blur into one another, and in which historical frameworks, though necessarily also break down. But underlying the semantic field, there exists a continuum of unequal and exploitative economic, social, and political phenomena that impacts directly on the relationships among science and technology and has ethical consequences that have yet to be fully explored. Okay, so what does this mean? So they're talking about the semantic field. Semantics is words, right? It's about how you say things. So they're talking about this field of terms that moves around colonialism and imperialism, and those boundaries aren't really clear, and then also the boundaries between countries become unclear between conqueror and conquered, the imperializer and the colonized, etc. Like these boundaries blur, but underlying that there is sort of unequal and exploitative economic, social, and political effects, right? That's sort of the upshot of all this, is that it creates unequal circumstances, and again, extracts resources, whether it be goods, labor, money, etc., in favor of the imperial country. So in this case, England, yes. So there were many justifications for this, yes. But the ultimate ideological justification for imperialism and colonialism is racism. And that is sort of an understood and given phenomenon. And this is also from the Encyclopedia of Science, Technology, and Ethics. Any quotes in this are from that. And they say, colonialism is thus more than a set of institutions or practices that permit the establishment and maintenance of unequal economic exchanges, right? So it's more than just this unequal economic exchange. Underlying colonial economic relations and institutions are evolving beliefs or ideologies that make possible the permanence and reproductions of colonialism. Western culture is thus permeated by pseudo-rational justifications of racial hierarchies, which would seem to ground colonialism on nature. Yeah. So a lot of the justifications for, say, British rule of India, of places in Africa, of all, islands, all kinds of places, was this underlying belief that whiteness was better, right? That there is this racial hierarchy sort of justified by science. And there are a lot of scientific texts that back that up from the time, again, which would seem to ground colonialism in some sort of natural hierarchy, which we know is not true, yes? But that's really the ultimate justification. So we can see why the people of India are pushing back against this. They want home rule, is what they call it. And this has been ongoing for a long time. So, the effects of the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, what are they, and how these concepts sort of taken shape today, and why is this relevant for this book, right? So I'll read one more quote for you too. The importance of the study of colonial and post-colonial structures and ideologies resides in the fact that contemporary international economic and cultural relations and realities, rather than being their negation, can be read as their continuation, right? So it's not like we've sort of gotten rid of colonialism, but we've sort of continued it in different ways. In fact, contemporary American, African, and Asian national boundaries are part of the colonial inheritance, right? These borders, drawn according to purely administrative and political criteria by the imperial powers, without taking into account cultural, ethnic, linguistic, or historical differences among the diverse populations thus brought together, have been a contributing factor to the ethnic and national violence that have plagued post-colonial areas. So this is a general statement, but in terms of the partition of India, which happened after World War II, they basically, sort of drew some arbitrary lines, which then led to an insane amount of violence, which is what is depicted in this novel, right? Leading up to it. We haven't really gotten there now. But this map here is sort of talking about like the different migrations that had to happen when they split Pakistan from India, and then also created Bangladesh, right? that, people are sort of migrating. These lines are, Muslim migration, Hindu Sikh migration, sort of partitioned provinces, all of this stuff, right? Things that are, literally breaking up a country, dividing it into these areas and assuming that that's going to work somehow. So that's sort of the legacy of British colonialism in India, is the partition ended up being this really sort of insanely violent division. Yeah. But then, sort of the bottom line of colonialism is international economic inequality is the most egregious legacy of empire, and we still sort of live with that today. Okay, so getting to the book, some major themes. Obviously, the effects of colonialism pop up across the novel. I'm not going to talk too much about that since I just gave you a whole lecture on it. But then some other themes that I see are political upheaval, the sort of background of the politics that are happening, the child narrator, and sort of reading from that perspective and how it changes what we see and how we see it. And then also the undertones of violence in the novel, and they will become overtones later, but in the first part, they're sort of underlying the text. Okay, so political upheaval, that's happening sort of in the background really reveals the cultural divides in the novel. So Lenny's family is upper class, and they have many domestic servants that are diverse in race and religion. So they have English, Sikh, and Muslim neighbors. Ayah, the nanny, is Hindu. They themselves are Parsi, right? So it's a very diverse religious group. And as we see, let me just go back to this map really quick. India was sort of what we know of India now was sort of meant to be largely Hindu. Pakistan was meant to be largely Muslim. Bangladesh largely Sikh, right? But that, those boundaries aren't real, right? As we see in the novel, there are many people of different religions and ethnicities that are blended together. So then, when you draw lines and say this religion has to be here, this religion has to be here, a lot of upheaval is occurring. So Lenny sort of overhears and interprets the political situation through the adults surrounding her, through these this diverse group that she's surrounded with. So one scene that I think is interesting is the scene in which the kids and all their sort of domestic workers are trying to steal the gardener's dhoti. And a dhoti is basically like a wrap that you use as pants, right? So it's this jumble of different people coming together, and they're playing, they're having fun. Everybody sort of has a different role in it. And they're all sort of like, it's lighthearted. And she even says many times, like, the gardener was in on it. Like, he's a part of it too. But then it ends in this really violent scene where Mucho beats her daughter, Papu, which I think is kind of foreshadowing, right? It sort of foreshadows the clash of different, this very violent clash of different religions that's going to happen. And it also sort of coalesces on the female body, which we'll talk more about. But, this sort of once somewhat idyllic scene of, all these people coming together and playing ends in this really violent moment, that sort of shakes us. And it just so happens to be on this girl's body, which becomes relevant, I think, later as the novel progresses, right? So the background of political upheaval really is sort of revealing these cultural divides. And in the first part of the novel that we've read so far, there's a lot of, these scenes of coming together. And as soon as we start the second half, we'll see that kind of fracturing a little bit. Okay, so another thing that I think is really important in this book is the child narrator. So we're seeing everything through Lenny's perspective. The reader's understanding of the world of the book is shaped by her childhood perspectives. She does seem to understand more than a young child would, right? Like, if I think of myself when I was 7, I don't think I would have understood these really complex political situations. And she doesn't either, but we also sometimes hear from an older version of Lenny, right? It zooms out a little bit sometimes when it's like, if I had only known, right? And also, one consequence of the child narrator is that the reader doesn't get much context for any of the conversations. Like, we have to fill in the blanks. And that's part of why this novel is so hard for, a Western audience, because we don't have that context, right? There's a lot of stuff that we're using context clues to put together. But the reason that's interesting is it also is what the child is doing, right? It mimics the child's experience of using context clues to understand her surroundings, right? So, a couple of examples of this. The very first words of the novel is, "My world is compressed." And that really gives us a sense of like the sort of smallness of of Lenny's perspective, how it's shaped by the very small, even spatially, right? Like two streets. And then another sort of example is how she refers to some of her family members: electric aunt, slave sister, which, like, problematic term, I understand. But it also gives us a sense of like who this character is through Lenny's eyes, right? She, these are not their real names. These are like a child sort of understanding of these people based on their characters. Yeah, like only referring to cousin by cousin instead of his name. Yeah. And there are many scenes in which she does not understand the implications of what she hears, right? So, for example, the dinner party where they have their Sikh neighbors and their English neighbors over, and Lenny and her brother hide under the table. Yeah, like that's a scene where we get all of this stuff that maybe we understand, maybe we don't, but Lenny really doesn't get it, right? So we're only seeing it from her perspective, so we're having to fill in those gaps too, and we're trying to sort of work it out along with her. So the last theme I want to speak about, and then I'll talk to you about your discussion post, is this sort of undertones of violence, and especially sexual violence. So Ayah, the nanny, is at the center of this entourage of men that want her attentions. And so much of the book is about Ayah and Lenny's relationship with her and what she sort of learns through those interactions. Aya's constantly fighting off of advances from the men around her. An example of that is Ice Candyman's toes, right? Like the sort of incursions on her personal space. Imam Din, which is a character that we, are supposed to like, right? We don't have animosity towards this character. He takes Lenny back to his hometown, right? Is called the catcher in the kitchen because he sort of is constantly trying to, get at Ayah physically, right? And Lenny learns about, interactions between men and women from what she sees while she's with Ayah, from, how she sees these men advance on her. And the sexual overtones here have somewhat violent undertones, right? Lenny speaks of sort of conquest and battles, and like I said, like incursions onto Ayah's person through these men that she's constantly having to fight off, right? Which again is a little bit of a foreshadowing situation because of what's to come, the violence that's to come from the partition, especially how it plays out on women's bodies. So there's this like real undercurrent of violence that goes throughout the novel. We see it in the scene where Mucho beats her daughter. We see it, in many places, even though the partition hasn't really began. The sort of tension is there, right? We feel the tension in these scenes. Okay, so for your discussion post, I basically want you to think about a scene analysis, perform a scene analysis through the lens of one of the 4 themes that we have discussed this week. So the effects of colonialism, political upheaval, the child narrator, or these undertones of violence. I want you to include a quote, like in quotes and descriptions from the scene, and then discuss the elements of that theme in that scene, right? So, flip back through the pages, pick a scene that you think is emblematic of one of these themes, and write about it. Tell us why you think it's emblematic. Do a little bit of analysis for us. As usual, your post should be at least 250 words, and respond to at least 2 of your peers as usual. And those responses can be, something you find particularly insightful, something that you also noticed, thoughts that the post made you think, right? Anything like that. So, all right. I'll be back next week with more Cracking India. Make sure that you're looking at the looking ahead to next week files, because those are important to help you sort of understand what's going on. Let me know if you have any questions about anything, and I will see you all very soon. All right. Have a good week. Bye.